So, a digital nomad in Bali did a feature with Business Insider about why he left Bali and why it's not worth living there anymore. And as you can imagine, there was a huge backlash. People were angry on social media, and it caused such an uproar that he sent a newsletter this week to thousands of his subscribers explaining the situation and sort of offering apologies, sort of not. And I was just watching this whole thing play out online, and I have a lot of thoughts and comments about it. So I figured rather than add to the Instagram comments, why don't I make a video explaining what happened and my insights into whether his complaints are warranted or not. Now, there's three main reasons that people are angry. The first one is that because this digital nomad did a feature with CNBC just a year before, singing Bali's praises and telling people on how they can live a life of luxury for just around $2,000 per month. So this got hundreds of thousands of views online. It was on YouTube, it was all over social media. And then just a year later, he's retracting that claim and he's saying why he left Bali. And so people are like, wait, what? That's hypocritical. But more than what he said on paper, what I think is most interesting is the psychology behind this sequence of events. Because here we have in year one, loving Bali, loving the lifestyle, and telling the world about it. And then in year two, not so much, leaving the island and going elsewhere. And so at the end of this video, I'm going to explain what I think was going on there because it has a lot to do with the different phases of culture shock. And if you're aware of these signs and symptoms, then you can know if you're experiencing something similar when you travel or live in a different country. Now, the second thing that people are mad about is his privilege to be able to come into a country as a foreigner, live there, enjoy a low cost of living and a high quality of life, and then up and leave when things get difficult. The locals in Bali have been struggling, and especially during and since the pandemic. And there is a tension right now between the locals and the expats and the tourists. And so I'll explain a bit about what's happening there. And then the third reason that people are angry is, I think, out of frustration that some of what he's saying is actually true. There are legitimate problems in Bali, from overdevelopment and over tourism to horrible pollution, traffic, a cost of living crisis, water problems, and more. Recently, it's also been this invasion of expats, remote workers, and even refugees of the Russian war in Ukraine. Tens of thousands of refugees have also been pouring into Bali, causing a lot of issues. And the governor of Bali has actually lobbied the central government in Jakarta to revoke the visa on arrival for Ukrainian and Russian citizens. So we're going to talk about that as well. There's a lot to digest here, so let's get into it. And let me know what you think in the comments below. Okay, first, let's take a look at the article so you can judge for yourself what you think about this situation. Okay, if we look at the first article here, and this was from February of 2022, I think the headline really says it all. This 33-year-old left the US for Bali to live a life of luxury on $2,200 per month. See how he spends his money. And he says here, I live better in Bali than I did in the US. Here's how much it costs. So this is a very common trend of promoting Bali as a destination for remote workers, digital nomads, and other foreigners who are looking to live there long term. So we're going to make the distinction in just a minute about expats versus tourists, because this is a big misconception here. But what is very accurate is that there's been this influencer culture cropping up in Bali with people who've only been there for a few weeks or a few months, making all of these posts that are photoshopped and edited and look so great. And they are promoting Bali as a destination, usually to either get likes or for some other form of self-interest. And so you see a lot of articles online promoting not just Bali, but a lot of other destinations as well. So it says that he grew up in Nigeria, then moved to London, and then the US. So he's definitely lived in a lot of countries around the world, and he has legitimate reasons for wanting to leave the US. He says that being a person of color, he didn't feel valued as a human being sometimes. And like many of us, he had this desire to travel and see the world. So totally relatable, nothing wrong with that. And he talks about his story of becoming a digital nomad, starting with no money whatsoever, and his business journey. But as fate would have it, one day he was scrolling the old Instagram, saw a picture of Bali, and the rest is history. He bought a ticket in 2019 and never looked back. It talks here about how he used visa runs or tourist visa extensions to be able to stay in the country for more than 30 to 60 days at a time. And this is a really common practice called perpetual tourism, where foreigners who are living in a country without a visa or work permit can just live on their passport stamps, essentially coming and going. And it's not allowed, and it could be illegal in many cases. So it is a practice that you need to check with your country of where you're going to even see if it's possible to do this. But it's usually discouraged because governments want you to either have a work visa or a residence permit or something like that that allows you to stay there. But it does happen in Bali, in Mexico, in lots of different places. So it seems like that's what he was doing and earning about $140,000 per year. So this is notable because the minimum wage in Bali comes out to less than $200 per month. So that's like $1 an hour. So you have a lot of people living on six figures per year. Potentially, there's estimates that there's around 30,000 expats living in Bali. I don't know how much they all make, but the foreigners and the tourists are definitely have a higher income than the locals if they're able to work remotely and pull in six figures a year. So you've got this income disparity between locals and foreigners that happens in a lot of countries. So this is not unique to Bali. But he breaks down his cost of living here, $2,233 per month. I'll link to this article so you guys can read it later. But falling in love with Bali. This is what is known as the honeymoon phase of the curve of cultural adaptation. So there is a curve that has been scientifically demonstrated that is the general phases that you go through when you move to a new country. And everyone's favorite phase is the honeymoon phase because this is when you first arrive to a place and everything seems great. It's like you're seeing everything through rose-colored glasses. And it seems that that is what Olu did here. He got to Bali, he saw how beautiful it was, how nice the people were, how low the cost of living was compared to what he was spending in the US. And he thought, hey, I'm in paradise. And I think anyone who's been to Bali has definitely seen that side of it. But the longer that you stay in a country, the more that facade of the honeymoon phase starts to crack. It is like a marriage or a relationship where you can be in that honeymoon phase at the beginning, but the longer you're with someone, the more you might have problems or you might argue. And so that is how the name came around. So he talks here about all of the things that he loved about Bali. And on the last line here, it says, something about Bali grounds me here. It finally feels like home. So that was last year. Fast forward to this year, almost exactly 1 year later, and he says, I make $140,000 a year running a digital nomad agency from Bali, but here's why it's not worth living there anymore. And let's see what he says. So he moved to Bali, as we know, in 2019, but he says that Bali is now polluted, congested, and overly commercialized. And he says that living in Southern Europe is a better choice for digital nomads. Now, we'll look at what he's complaining about in just a second, but if we pull up the curve of cultural adaptation, and this is by the good old US State Department, we see the honeymoon phase, then we see the frustration phase, and then adaptation and acceptance. There's actually two phases there. You begin to adapt, then you accept and integrate with the new destination. And after that, there's also reverse culture shock when you come back to your home country. I have some videos about that that I will link to in the description below. But it looks to me like Olu left Bali during the frustration phase and didn't wait until he got to the adaptation and acceptance phase. So he didn't fully integrate with the country. As it says here, the honeymoon phase can last a relatively long time if you're adapting easily and enjoying the process, but it can also last a short time if your adaptation is difficult or slow. And if you've been to Bali, then your honeymoon phase could have lasted a day, a week, a month, 6 months. It depends on where you were in Bali and what your experience was. And we'll get to that in just a second. But the frustration phase is where language and cultural barriers become too much to handle. And this is where you either need to wait it out, join the struggle and adapt, or leave. And in Olu's case, it looks like he just decided to leave. Would he be able to reach this adaptation and acceptance phase? I guess we'll never know. But if you find yourself in the same position, then remember this cultural adaptation curve. You could just be in the frustration part and need some more time to be able to really, really feel at home there. So in this article, he details how he makes money and from where. It looks like a digital marketing agency, cryptocurrency, and hosting virtual events. But then, like many people, he saw the photos of people with palm trees, coconuts, and laptops, and he thought, I want to go there. So he went and he liked it, but he also struggled with loneliness. So although he says some of the good things about Bali here, he says it's too polluted and traffic is insane. Now, there is some truth to this because in 2018, the Balinese government declared a trash emergency because 50 tons of trash per day was washing up on the beaches. And they've taken some steps to try to clean up the land and the waters, but pollution is still a big issue, not just the trash, but also the traffic and the smog. Indonesia is the second largest polluter in the world after China. So this argument does hold water. Speaking of which, water is also a problem in Bali, and local residents have complained that the infrastructure can't cope with the massive amount of people and development in the area. And in some cases, it's allegedly illegal development where people lie about what they're building, or there's also been allegations of bribery and corruption of local officials to let hotels and developers build bigger buildings. And so that's another issue as well. Now, before tourism was Bali's biggest industry, agriculture was. But now there have been articles online about rice paddies being literally paved over. So the reduction in green spaces, the increase of people, and the increase of traffic, and you do get pollution and smog. Another one of his qualms here is that there's a misconception of being a digital nomad in Bali that it's a vacation, that you won't have to work or anything. And I don't think many people have that misconception anymore. I think anyone who's worked remotely knows that you work more when you work from home than you do when you work in an office in many cases. And a lot of us are having problems unplugging, whether you're in Kansas or New York or Bali. And so I don't know. I don't think that many people think that remote workers are on vacation all the time. So if you do have that expectation when you go to Bali, then you will be sadly mistaken, but it will work the same wherever you are in the world. He also says that getting a digital nomad visa to live in Bali is difficult. So staying in Bali long term is too difficult because the government wants over $100,000 to be put into a state-owned bank account for you to be able to stay there. Now, Bali doesn't have a digital nomad visa yet, like other countries. As I mentioned, they do have 30 to 60-day tourist visas, but they also have some non-lucrative visas and investment visas if you would like to stay longer. And these do cost more money, but that's normal of anywhere in the world. It's only been in the past couple of years that any country has had a digital nomad visa. So before the pandemic, the only way to stay in countries as a remote worker was either to apply for a work permit, which is very difficult, or to get a golden visa, which is basically buying residency or buying a passport, usually in the 6 to 7 figures. So there's nothing specifically about Bali that's harder, in my opinion, than other countries. I mean, now some countries do have digital nomad visas that will allow you to stay there for 1, 2, or 3 years, but that's very recent. And I don't think it's anything out of the ordinary that Bali has these schemes because they're very similar to what other countries are offering. But they do have a second home visa for foreigners and retirees. And they also have had more than 3,000 people apply for the existing visa to be able to stay and work remotely for at least 6 months. So there are some options. He also mentions that it's gotten too commercialized and overdeveloped. It's not as relaxed as it once was. And this kind of cracks me up because the first time he went there was in 2019. And this is all about perspective. If you went there in 2019 and then you left in 2022 or 2023, you're going to have a much different perspective of what relaxing versus commercialized Bali is compared to if you were there in the early 90s and then you left in the early 2000s. I mean, the first time I went to Bali was 2008, and I did find it quite relaxing and like a magical paradise. And when I went back in 2015, I kind of felt how Olu feels now, that it was too overcrowded and too commercialized. So that was 4 years before he arrived. So this is really all about personal perspective. And I'm sure that the locals have a much different perspective than Australian surfers who have been going there for the past few years or so, or tourists from around the world who've been going to Bali for years. So I think it's going to depend on your exact experience, and it's not something to tell other people not to go there. But he does have a point about the overdevelopment. As I mentioned, the landscapes are being paved over. And coming from a small town in Florida, we used to be known for our orange groves, but now all of those orange groves have been sold to housing developers, and orange trees have been replaced with housing development. So I can definitely see how this problem would be happening in Bali, where rice paddies are being paved over to put hotels and villas. So he does have a point with that. The realtors in Bali have said that sales are 3 to 4 times higher in 2023 than they have been in the previous 10 years. And there's been up to a 10 times increase in buyers from the Ukraine and Russia. So more people are buying and investing in Bali. There's been a housing shortage. It's become a seller's market. So there is additional commercialization, and there's no signs of it slowing down anytime soon. He also makes a valid point about the influencer culture in Bali. And this has been an issue that's gotten a lot of attention online because of some bad behavior by different influencers. Now, yes, maybe around much of the world these days, we're used to seeing selfie sticks and selfies and people filming content for social media. But Bali, because of its beautiful landscapes and people and culture, has definitely attracted more than their fair share of influencers. And sometimes no harm done. But there have been reports of influencers filming very dangerous stunts or flagrantly ignoring health protocols during the COVID pandemic. One girl was allegedly deported for painting on a fake face mask before going into the grocery store. But it's not just influencers, it's tourists in general. And I did see a headline that said that Australian tourists are no longer, quote unquote, the worst. And there's also been this trend in people who are in Bali on tourist visas working illegally, advertising their businesses on social media, and in some cases, teaching people how to stay in Bali without a valid work permit or residence permit. So, this has been a problem. And there's even been Instagram accounts run by anonymous locals of people calling out both influencers and also local tourists who are working illegally. And the Indonesian Workers Union has stated that foreign tourists who work illegally are a form of colonialism in the modern era. Their chairman even compared this to, quote, an occupation without the use of weapons. Those are strong words, and Bali has had a very turbulent history of colonialism, violence, and occupation. So it's pretty significant to hear that type of language from the locals. They do not sound happy. Now, there are remote workers working illegally, as well as people working in person and from all different countries, but there has been a big focus on Russian tourists who are working illegally, and they're taking physical jobs as well as remote jobs. So they're doing things like photography, working at hair salons, tattoo artists, motorbike rentals, real estate, all sorts of jobs. And the authorities are cracking down on that. The local government has deported some people for working illegally. They are arresting people. And Bali's governor has also lobbied the central government to revoke visa on arrival for Russian and Ukrainian citizens. People have a lot of opinions about this as well. And there's only about 8,500 Ukrainians compared to 60,000 Russians. So the Ukrainian embassy has said that they haven't had such a negative impact on the area, but this is also up for debate as well. Another reason that locals don't like this is because foreigners don't pay taxes. So it's like a triple whammy. They are working illegally, taking local jobs, they're not paying taxes, and they're earning much more than the locals do. But if we go back to Olu's article, he says traffic is insane, and a 5-minute drive often becomes a 30-minute wait in traffic. The beaches are dirty and unpleasant, and the pollution seems out of control. I have to wear a mask when I'm on a motorbike to avoid inhaling the exhaust smoke from construction trucks. With all of the issues in Bali, it seems like a longer wait to get to the beach for a foreigner should be the least of people's worries, but bad traffic does affect everyone as well as pollution and has a huge impact on the animal life there. This also goes back to an issue of inaccurate expectations where what people expect when they get to Bali is the Instagram version, but what they get is the reality. So there is a disconnect there from those photoshopped pictures to what it's really like. And this is a problem because tourism in general is a double-edged sword for Bali. The island depends on it, but it also results in these other problems. But it doesn't seem like the government wants to slow tourism down anytime soon. And it's also ironic that Olu has these complaints now when tourism is at a fraction of what it was before the pandemic. It's only recovered to about half of the annual tourism arrivals compared to prior to COVID-19. What really struck me from reading this article is that the problems that he mentions were still problems before, and they were problems when he arrived there. But if we look at the tourism arrivals to Bali, there have been more than 1 million tourists per year since the early 90s. We look at the numbers in 2000, it was 1.4 million tourists, primarily from Australia, Japan, Taiwan, the UK, and the US. Then in 2018, 6.5 million tourists from Australia, China, India, Malaysia, and Singapore. And then in 2023, the top 5 countries for tourists were Australia, India, Russia, Malaysia, and South Korea. So, what I see here is that millions of tourists from the same countries over the last 20 years has been something that's been very constant in the Balinese economy. Now there's a lot of attention on digital nomads, but there's so few digital nomads that I don't think there's the same level of gentrification simply due to nomads. It's due to a combination of the millions of tourists per year, the trend towards overdevelopment, and also other expats who are not nomads, but who are going to live in Bali long term to retire, who are working in local businesses, etc. So Australia has been the largest source of tourists to Bali since at least 2000. I think that's because it's so close to Bali. Bali has great waves. There's lots of surfers in Australia as well. And it's mostly tourists from Australia, Southeast Asia, and also the UK, then the US. So that hasn't changed. It was definitely that way when he was there in 2019, and it remains that way today. He also mentions predatory behavior from locals. There's definitely theft in Bali, as there is in many areas that rely on tourism for their economy. There can be money exchange scams and lots of things that you would see in other countries. So he is correct, but that's also not something that is unique to Bali. He also notes that the quality of life in Bali has dropped, especially when compared to some cities in Europe like Prague and Barcelona. Now, I would say that Barcelona is much more expensive than Bali. It would be very hard to have the same quality of life in Barcelona compared to Bali. But as he says, $2,000 can only get you so far in Bali these days. And that is true. Whereas the cost of living used to be less than $1,000 per month for foreigners who are living there, it can easily cost you $2,000 now for rent. So that is an issue. It's also something that's happening in Thailand and cities around the world as more and more people are able to work remotely, work from anywhere. And there's more vacation rentals, more Airbnbs out there. And that does put upward pressure on the housing prices. And I think all of us have been affected by the global cost of living crisis. So Europe is certainly not immune to that. And you will get a different lifestyle living in Europe, but it's really hard to compare Europe with Bali. They're completely different cultures, different continents. I mean, they're different in so many ways. So in my opinion, this is just a personal preference of his. This is a very individual decision. And it seems like he's making that decision that I don't necessarily think needs to be a blanket statement for people who are thinking of going to Bali, or to recommend to people who are interested in Bali that they might get what they're looking for in Europe. I think a lot of the European tourists to Bali would have a different opinion there. This is a part that made people mad, where he says, if you're paying to live in a wooden shack in a noisy, overcrowded city, is it worth saving some money? And, people were mad that he could just leave, or that it was insulting to Bali to call it that. But again, try being a local earning minimum wage in Bali and trying to find good housing. He also makes a very bold statement that Europe is now the best option for digital nomads. And while he enjoyed his 4 years spent living in Bali, he's left for Southern Europe. This is very subjective. Many people have said that even places like Italy, Spain, Portugal, and Greece that he has mentioned have also been affected by an increase in the cost of living, tourism, especially housing prices, partially due to remote workers. So I don't think that there's anywhere in the world that's a very attractive place for people to go and live and work that's going to be immune from these issues for very long. He is right that more people need to speak up about these issues rather than romanticizing the once perfect island to promote their personal brands and businesses. But romanticizing the quote unquote once perfect island to promote their personal brands and businesses, that's something that people got angry about, because in the previous article, he was doing just that 1 year ago. And he did acknowledge that in his newsletter that that could come across that way. But nowhere is perfect, guys. And I think at this point, we know that Instagram posts are being manipulated and edited, but those things that make Bali Bali, I think are still there. I haven't been in a few years, but I think that there's a way to go to Bali and enjoy it without being a part of the problem. And I don't think that these are reasons to avoid Bali completely. He says these are the places where digital nomads will flock to once they realize the downsides of living in Bali. However, there are downsides to living in every country. If it's not one problem, it's another. That's not to say that we shouldn't confront these problems and try to solve them. I think that is more something for the local government and local and international tourism operators to really take responsibility for, especially developers and big businesses. But there also are things that you can do to be a responsible tourist, visitor, or short term resident in Bali. From what I've read, the people just want tourists to respect their culture, respect their land, respect their laws, and just be empathetic and good people when they're there. So don't pollute. Try to support local businesses and local homestays and bed and breakfasts instead of going to the biggest corporate hotels. Pay people who work for you a fair wage if you're there operating a local business or if you own a home there. And don't break the laws. Don't work illegally. Don't flaunt that you're working illegally and that you don't have to pay any taxes. Try to contribute to the local economy. Make sure you have the right paperwork to be able to live and work there, and be respectful. Respect the local culture, respect the people, respect their customs, regardless of what your personal beliefs are. When you're in another country, you need to follow their rules. The biggest problem that popular tourism destinations face is tourism and the byproducts that come from that. Remote workers and digital nomads like Olu can have a bigger impact than tourists if you are staying in the country longer. So it's more important to not just spread the word about your complaints about a destination, but if you are going to be living there for 4 or 5 years, then try to do something to make a difference while you're there. Join local conservation organizations and activist groups. Get your paperwork in order. Get to know the people and ask what they want help with. What are the problems that matter the most to them? I remember years ago, the founder of Nomad List was working with a group to try to reduce plastic and replace plastic bottles with biodegradable ones. So there is a lot that you can do, not just in Bali, but wherever you travel. But what do you think? Is Bali ruined, as Olu says, or is it still paradise? And do you agree with the way that he went about voicing his concerns? Let me know in the comments below. And to hear my perspective on the reality of long-term travel, watch this video next.